The sound came first, a racket like 1,000 tin pots being struck at once. It was a frantic, chattering alarm that scraped the nerves and set teeth on edge, the sound the town of Providence Creek had come to associate with Elspeth's folly. But this time, it was different. This time, the sound was met not with curses and slammed shutters, but with a profound, prayerful silence. Men stood in their barren fields, hats in their hands, listening. Women paused on their porches, hands clasped at their aprons, their faces turned toward the dry patch of land at the edge of town. They were listening to the sound of their own salvation, and it was the most ridiculous noise in the world. From the doorway of her small cabin, Elspeth watched her flock pour out into the gray light of dawn. 127 mottled, helmet-headed birds, a roiling river of gray and white, surging into the day. They moved with a purpose that had once looked like madness and now looked like grace. A year earlier, this had all been unthinkable. A year earlier, Elspeth had been a young woman alone, with nothing to her name but 10 acres of scorned earth and the deed her father had left her, a document that felt more like an apology than an inheritance. The land was bad. Everyone knew it. It was high ground, sun-baked and stony, with soil thin as a worn sheet, perched just far enough from the creek to be a misery to water. Her neighbors, the Gundersons and the Picketts, had fields of rich bottomland loam. They pitied her. They said it loud enough for her to hear when she went to the mercantile for flour and salt. A shame, a young woman alone on a patch like that, Mrs. Gunderson would say. Can't grow nothing but rocks and regret. Elspeth would just nod, her face still, her gaze fixed on the cracker barrel, as if she were counting the nails in its staves. She did not say that regret was a luxury she could not afford. She did not say that she had spent her nights walking that land, feeling the pathetic dust under her bare feet, tasting the dry air, and knowing it was all she had. Then came the day Jedediah Smith packed his wagon, his face a mask of bitter defeat. His own homestead, 5 miles farther out, had failed. He was selling everything for pennies on the dollar, desperate for enough cash to get his family back east. Elspeth went not to buy, but to watch, to see the anatomy of a dream's death laid bare. And there, in a hastily built pen, was the source of his final humiliation, a flock of guinea fowl. They were ugly things, with featherless heads and strange bony crests, their bodies shaped like teardrops. They shrieked and paced, a storm of nervous energy. Take him, Jedediah pleaded, his voice hoarse. Lord knows nobody else wants the noisy devils, the men standing around laughed. Worse than coyotes for noise, one said. And tougher to eat than boot leather, another added. Elspeth watched them. She saw how they moved, their heads darting, their eyes sharp and black. She saw them pecking incessantly at the ground, ignoring the feed Jedediah had thrown them. They were hunting. While the men saw worthless noise, Elspeth saw tireless industry. She remembered something her grandmother used to say, a whisper from a childhood spent on a different, greener farm. Some creatures work for you, and some work with you. The arithmetic was simple. Jedediah wanted $1 for the lot. She had $2 and a handful of change to her name. It was a fool's bargain, trading half her worldly wealth for a pen full of mockery. She did it anyway. As she herded the squawking, frantic birds down the dusty road toward her property, the laughter followed her all the way home. She didn't look back. She just kept her eyes on the strange, bobbing heads of her new flock, and for the first time since her father's passing, she felt the faint, unfamiliar stirring of a plan. The first task was housing them. Chickens would settle for a coop. Guineas, she learned, saw a coop as a suggestion, not a command. They preferred to roost in the highest branches of the single, skeletal oak that grew on her property, dots of gray against the twilight sky. The town's judgment was swift. Can't even keep her birds in a pen, Pickett muttered to the postmaster. It's a disgrace, Elspeth heard him. She kept working. She spent a week hauling stones from the field, her hands cracking and bleeding, to build a low, solid wall for a shelter. She roofed it with scavenged planks and sod. It was less a house and more a cave, dug partly into the slight rise of the land. She did not try to force them into it. Instead, she began a ritual. Every evening, she would scatter a small handful of precious cracked corn just inside the shelter's entrance. For a week, they ignored it, preferring to roost in the wind. Then one evening, a single bird, bolder than the rest, darted in, snatched a kernel, and darted out. The next night, 3 followed. By the 3rd week, as the autumn nights grew a knife's edge of cold, the entire flock would funnel into the stone shelter at dusk, their soft, conversational clicks replacing the day's frantic alarms. It was her first victory, a secret she kept like a coal banked low under ash. Her only confidant was Old Man Hemlock. He was an immigrant from somewhere in the old country, a place with mountains and hard winters. He lived on a small plot even more marginal than hers, but his garden was a legend. He spoke in a thick, gentle accent, and his words were often gnarled and strange, like the roots of his ancient fruit trees. He came by one afternoon, leaning on the fence, his eyes not on Elspeth but on the birds as they ranged across her field. They moved like a single organism, a flowing tide of gray, pecking, always pecking. "They are good workers," he said, his voice a low rumble. Elspeth, wary of more mockery, just nodded. "Town says they're good for nothing," she said, her own voice tight. Hemlock smiled, a slow parting of his wrinkled lips. "The town knows chickens. A chicken is a servant. It stays where you put it, eats what you give it. It is a stupid bird for a stupid farmer." He gestured with a gnarled hand toward the guineas. "This is not a servant. This is a partner. It knows the land. It finds its own food. You must learn what it is trying to tell you." He looked at her then, his pale blue eyes sharp and kind. "The land speaks," he said, the words falling like seeds into soil. "A good animal speaks the language of the land it needs. You only have to learn to listen." The advice was as strange as the man himself, but it settled in Elspeth's mind. That evening, she didn't just watch her birds. She listened. She watched what they ate. They ignored the few blades of grass. They were after insects, spiders, and tiny seeds she couldn't even see. They were cleaning her land. Day after day, she worked. She cleared a half-acre for a garden, a back-breaking task of prying stones from the thin soil. The men who rode by on the road saw a lone woman engaged in a fool's errand on a cursed plot of land. They didn't see the flock of 127 birds following in her wake, meticulously picking the disturbed soil clean of every grub, every beetle, every pest. She was not just clearing a field. She was preparing a kingdom for them, and they, in turn, were preparing it for her. The work was slow, methodical, and deeply solitary. It was a rhythm of digging, hauling, and watching, punctuated by the steady, industrious chatter of the guineas. The loneliness was a physical presence, a weight in the quiet cabin at night. But then, in the mornings, the clamor of the birds would begin, and she would rise, not alone, but as a keeper, a partner in a strange and noisy enterprise. By June, her garden was a shock of green against the dun-colored land. While Mrs. Gunderson was complaining at the mercantile about the squash bugs that had decimated her vines and Pickett was grumbling about the beetles on his potatoes, Elspeth's plants were thriving. They were strong, unbothered, and vibrant. The guineas were the reason. They patrolled the edges of the garden relentlessly, a feathered perimeter guard that devoured every crawling, creeping thing that dared approach. They never touched the plants themselves, seeming to understand the boundary between their world and hers. This was her second secret, and it was harder to keep. The vibrant green of her garden was visible from the road. One afternoon, a small, tow-headed boy appeared at her fence line. He was Finn, the youngest son of a sharecropper family with too many mouths and not enough bread. He was maybe 10, with eyes that saw everything. He wasn't looking at the garden. He was staring, mesmerized, at the birds. "They're funny looking," he said, without preamble. "They are," Elspeth agreed, not stopping her work of hilling up her potatoes. "What are their names?" Elspeth paused. She'd never thought of naming them. They were a collective, a flock, a tool. "They don't have names," she said. Finn looked horrified. "No names? But how do you tell them apart?" He pointed to a large male with a particularly proud wattle. "He looks like a general. You should call him General. And that one, the one that's always lagging behind. She's pokey." From that day on, Finn became a regular presence. He would show up after his chores were done, his small face serious, and undertake the solemn task of naming the flock. He had a genius for it. There was Screech, Chatterbox, Tripwire, and a trio of identical birds he called the Three Grays. He named a bossy female matron and her constant companion, Shadow. Elspeth found the exercise ridiculous, But she didn't stop him. The boy's quiet chatter was a welcome antidote to the town's scorn, and his affection for the birds humanized them in her eyes. They were no longer just a unit of labor. They were General and Pokey and the rest of the 127. Finn's presence softened the edges of her solitude. He would help her haul water, his small frame straining, and she would share the simple lunches she made for herself. He never asked for anything, but she saw the hunger in his eyes, the way he'd eat his bread slow to make it last. When her first squash ripened, she gave him one to take home. His mother sent back a message of thanks, her first kind word from anyone in town. The arithmetic of her life was beginning to change. Before, it was the math of subtraction: 1 woman, 10 acres of bad land, $2. Now, it was a cautious addition: 127 birds, 1 thriving garden, 1 small friend, 1 less family whispering behind her back. But with success came notice. Silas Blackwood, the cattle agent, began to ride by more often. He was a man whose warmth never reached his eyes. He ran the town council, held the notes on half the farms in the county, and had a way of making a compliment sound like a threat. He stopped his horse at her fence one July afternoon, taking in the sight of her heavy-laden tomato vines. "Well, I'll be," he said, his voice thick with false bonhomie. "Looks like you've worked a miracle here, little lady." Elspeth wiped sweat from her brow with the back of a dirty forearm. "The land's not as bad as people think." Blackwood's eyes weren't on the garden. They were on the creek in the distance. Her land, worthless for farming, was the most direct route from the high pastures to the only reliable water source for miles. "Still," he said, "must be hard work for a woman alone. I've been thinking, that plot of yours adjoins my grazing lease. I could take it off your hands, give you a fair price, enough to get you set up somewhere more suitable. In town, perhaps. I'm not selling," Elspeth said. Her voice was quiet, but it was flat and final as a stone. Blackwood's smile tightened. "Don't be hasty. A place like this, it can get away from you. 1 person alone. It's a lot to manage." He tipped his hat and rode off, but Elspeth felt a chill despite the summer heat. He hadn't been offering to buy her land. He had been telling her he wanted it. August arrived like the open door of a furnace. The sky turned a hard, empty blue, and the sun beat down with a personal malevolence. The creek, the lifeblood of Providence Creek, shrank back from its banks, exposing cracked mud and thirsty stones. The corn in the bottomland fields, which had stood so proud and green, began to yellow and curl at the edges. The laughter about Elspeth's folly had long since faded, replaced by a grudging curiosity. Her vegetables were the best, the only, produce to be had. She began taking a small handcart into town twice a week, laden with squash, beans, and potatoes. At first, people were hesitant, their pride a barrier. But hunger is a great persuader. Mrs. Gunderson, her own garden a wasteland of dust and withered vines, was her first customer. She bought a basket of beans and didn't meet Elspeth's eye, but the silver coins she paid with were real enough. Soon, a small crowd would be waiting for her. She set her prices fairly, lower than the mercantiles, and her cart was always empty within the hour. It was during one of these trips that the outside world found her. A man in city clothes, the cook from a wealthy rancher's outfit 50 miles east, was in town buying supplies. He saw the quality of her produce, the deep color of her tomatoes, the flawless skins of her potatoes. "Where did these come from?" he asked, his voice sharp with professional interest. "My place," Elspeth said simply. "How is it you have no insect damage?" "The grasshoppers have stripped everything bare out east." Elspeth looked at the faces around her. She could have told the truth. She could have explained the perimeter guard of shrieking, mottled birds. But she remembered Old Man Hemlock's quiet counsel and the value of a secret kept. "I've just been lucky," she said. The cook bought everything she had left. He paid her a premium and asked if she could supply his ranch directly. It was a turning point. The arithmetic in her head spun wildly. The income was more than she had ever imagined. It was enough for winter supplies, for new boots, for a real fence. It was the math of security. Her success did not go unnoticed by Silas Blackwood. He saw her card, saw the city cook handing her a wad of bills. His visits became more frequent, his tone less avuncular. "You're doing well," he said, stopping by her fence again. His eyes scanned her property, not with admiration, but with calculation. "But a dry spell like this, it can turn. What happens when your well gives out?" My offer still stands. I'd even raise it a little. Out of neighborly concern, of course, my well is deep, she replied, which was true. And I'm not selling. His face hardened for a fraction of a second before the smile slid back into place. A stubborn woman is a poor woman in the end, Miss Elspeth. Remember that his threat, veiled as it was clear. He was a man used to getting what he wanted, and he wanted her land. The drought was his ally. He believed it would break her, that it would parch her well and wither her garden, forcing her to accept his pittance. What he did not yet know was that the drought was about to unleash a far greater problem, and Elspeth, alone on her rocky patch of land, was the only one with the answer. She felt the shift before anyone else did. The air grew thick and still. The birdsong of the larks and sparrows fell silent. The only sounds were the wind and the constant, vigilant chatter of her own flock. Something was coming. The first sign was subtle. The Gundersons' best milk cow, Bessie, went off her feed. She stood listless in the parched pasture, head hanging low. 2 days later, she was dead. Mr. Gunderson, his face grim, said it was the heat. But when Pickett lost 2 steers in the same week, a new word began to be whispered in town. Ticks. It was not an unfamiliar scourge. Every few years, a bad season would bring them out. But this was different. The drought had concentrated the deer and other wildlife around the shrinking creek, and with them came a tide of hungry pests. These weren't the usual dog ticks. They were smaller, darker, and they carried a fever that burned through a herd like fire. At first, it was just the cattle. Blackwood's herds, the largest in the county, were hit hardest. He ordered his men to burn the pastures, sending plumes of acrid smoke into the cloudless sky. It didn't work. The ticks were already in the unburned scrub, in the leaf litter, on the desperate animals seeking shade. Then the fever jumped. Old Man Pickett's wife was the first human to fall ill, her body racked with chills and a fire that no amount of cool water could quench. Soon, 3 more families were tending to the sick. The town's doctor, a man more accustomed to setting bones and delivering babies, was helpless. He had no medicine for this. Panic, cold and sharp, began to settle over Providence Creek. The town became a place of closed doors and fearful eyes. The usual commerce ground to a halt. No one had the energy or the heart for it. The mockery of Elspeth and her flock was a distant memory. No one had time to laugh at her now. They were too busy being afraid. Through it all, Elspeth's life continued its rhythm. Her well held. Her garden, protected by its feathered guards, produced. Her birds, now numbering 153 after a successful spring hatching, grew fat and glossy. She and Finn, who now spent most of his days with her, were an island of calm in a sea of fear. Finn's family was blessedly untouched, living on the far side of town, but he brought stories of the sickness, his young face tight with worry. One afternoon, as Elspeth was mending a tear in her apron, she noticed something. A guinea, one of the new clutch, was pecking at the leg of her work trousers. She looked down. A tiny black speck was crawling up the denim. A tick. Without thinking, she brushed it off. The guinea snatched it from the air before it even hit the ground. A sudden, stunning thought struck her. She called Finn over. "Help me catch one," she said, her voice urgent. "General, he's the slowest." Together, they cornered the big male bird. Elspeth held him, his strange, reptilian feet surprisingly strong, while Finn gently parted the feathers around his neck and belly. The boy gasped. "Elspeth, look!" The bird's skin, where it was bare near the legs, was crawling with ticks. But they were not attached. They were scrambling, frantic, trying to escape the bird's relentless preening. And as they watched, the guinea's matron, trotted over and calmly began picking the ticks off General's neck, swallowing them one by one. Elspeth felt a wave of dizziness, the kind that comes from a sudden, world-altering realization. She let the bird go and sank to her knees in the dust. She looked at her hands, then at her land, then at the flock of birds moving like a cleansing tide across it. Her land wasn't just lucky. It was clean. The guineas were a walking, squawking extermination force. The arithmetic began again, but this time it was not about money or vegetables. It was the arithmetic of annihilation. One bird. How many ticks could it eat in a day? 100? 1,000? She watched them, truly watched them, for the rest of the afternoon. Their entire existence was a hunt. Peck, peck, swallow. Peck, peck, swallow. They were tireless. They were voracious. They were the cure. All this time, the town had seen them as a noisy nuisance. They had misread the language of the land completely. The birds were not speaking the language of annoyance. They were speaking the language of protection. The silence from the rest of the town grew heavier. It was the silence of despair. More cattle died. More people fell sick. The smoke from the burning fields did nothing but choke the air and blacken the horizon. Elspeth knew she could not keep her secret any longer. It was no longer a matter of pride or protecting her small success. It was a matter of life and death. The question was how to tell them. To simply announce it would invite disbelief, even scorn. Being right is its own kind of reply, but a hungry, frightened town is not always ready to listen. The opportunity came in the form of a knock on her door just after dusk. It was Mr. Gunderson, his shoulders slumped in defeat. His wife, the woman who had pitted Elspeth so openly, was now sick with the fever. "Miss Elspeth," he began, his voice rough. He wouldn't look at her, staring instead at the floorboards. I know we ain't been neighborly. Come in, Mr. Gunderson," she said softly. He stood awkwardly in her small cabin, his large frame seeming to shrink. "It's my wife," he choked out. "The doctor. He don't know what to do. And my last 2 cows, the ticks are all over them. All over the yard. It ain't safe for the children." He finally looked up, and Elspeth saw not pride, not pity, but raw, pleading terror. "I saw your garden," he said. "I seen you walking out here. You ain't sick. Your land, it seems clean. I don't know what you're doing, but I'm begging you. Is there anything you can do to help?" This was the moment. She could have gloated. She could have reminded him of his wife's words. She could have named a high price for her knowledge. Instead, she thought of the sick woman, of the frightened children. She thought of Old Man Hemlock's words about partners. "I have something that might work," she said. "It's the birds." Gunderson stared at her as if she'd finally confessed to the madness they'd all suspected. "The birds? The noisy ones. They eat ticks," Elspeth said simply. "They eat them all day long. My land is clean because they clean it." She explained what she and Finn had discovered, the way the birds hunted, the sheer number of pests they consumed. He listened, his skepticism warring with his desperation. Desperation won. "What do you want for them?" he asked, his voice flat with the expectation of being gouged. "A dozen birds. Let me and my boy Finn bring them over in the morning. We'll pen them in your yard for 3 days. There's no charge, Mr. Gunderson. You're my neighbor." He was so stunned by the generosity he couldn't speak. He just nodded, his eyes shining with unshed tears, and stumbled back out into the night. The next morning, Elspeth and Finn crated up 12 of the younger, more energetic guineas. The noise was deafening. They hauled the crates on the handcart to the Gunderson farm. The place felt dead. The air was thick with a feeling of sickness. As they unlatched the crates, the birds exploded out, immediately forming their tight, defensive flock and beginning their work. Peck, peck, swallow. They moved through the dusty yard like a whirlwind, their heads bobbing, their sharp eyes missing nothing. Elspeth, Finn, and Mr. Gunderson watched from the porch. For 3 days, they kept the birds penned on the property. On the evening of the 3rd day, Elspeth and Finn went to collect them. The change was breathtaking. The oppressive feeling of infestation was gone. The air felt lighter. Mr. Gunderson came out to meet them, his face transformed. "It's a miracle," he whispered. "They're just gone. The ticks are gone." He pressed a small, heavy pouch of coins into her hand. "It ain't enough, but it's what I have." Elspeth tried to refuse, but he insisted. "You saved us," he said. "You saved my family." That night, his wife's fever broke. Word of the Gunderson miracle spread through Providence Creek faster than the fever itself. It was not a thing to be believed, and yet the proof was there. The next day, 3 more farmers were at Elspeth's gate. The day after that, a delegation from the town council, minus Silas Blackwood, arrived, their hats in their hands. They no longer saw a foolish woman on a patch of bad land. They saw a prophet. The tide had turned. The chorus of skeptics had fallen silent, replaced by a chorus of the desperate. They came to her gate in a steady stream, their faces etched with fear and a new, humbling respect. They didn't ask for vegetables anymore. They asked for her birds. Elspeth and Finn worked from sunup to sundown, creating small teams of guineas, hauling them to infested homesteads, and teaching the stunned farmers how to manage them. She took payment when it was offered, but charged nothing to those who had nothing. Her price was fairness. Her currency was survival. She was not just selling a service. She was giving the town its life back. Her flock, once a symbol of her foolishness, was now a fleet of rescue vessels, dispatched to every corner of the valley. The Guineas, oblivious to their newfound fame, simply did what they had always done. They hunted, they ate, they chattered, they cleansed. Within 2 weeks, the tide of the fever began to recede. The sick started to recover. The oppressive fear that had blanketed Providence Creek began to lift, replaced by a fragile, tentative hope. And it was all because of the noisy, ridiculous birds. This, of course, could not be borne by Silas Blackwood. His own fortune, built on the health of his vast cattle herds, was crumbling. He had lost more than a third of his stock. His burned pastures were useless, and his remaining animals were still plagued. He had sneered at the talk of Elspeth's birds, calling it hysterical nonsense. But as his own losses mounted and her reputation grew, his scorn curdled into a venomous envy. He saw his power in the town slipping away, transferring to a young woman he had dismissed as insignificant. He called a town meeting. The summons was posted at the mercantile and the church. It was ostensibly to discuss a coordinated, county-wide response to the tick infestation. But everyone knew what it was really about. It was about Elspeth. The meeting was held in the small, clapboard town hall. It was packed. The air was thick with the smell of sweat, dust, and anxiety. Elspeth went, with Old Man Hemlock at her side for quiet support and Finn trailing just behind, his hand clutching her sleeve. She stood at the back, her face calm, her hands still. Blackwood stood at the front, behind a heavy oak table. He looked exhausted and angry. He opened the meeting with a grim accounting of the losses, the cattle, the crops, the human cost. Then he turned his attention to the solution. "There are rumors," he began, his voice dripping with condescension, "of a folk remedy. Of certain birds," he looked directly at Elspeth. "And while some have had temporary, small-scale success, a true crisis requires a coordinated, official response. We cannot rely on one person's hobby." He proposed a plan. The town council would assume control of all useful assets in the fight against the ticks. They would create a single, managed flock from Elspeth's birds to be deployed by his men, according to his direction. As the primary stakeholder in the cattle industry, he was the logical choice to lead the effort. He finished by saying the town would, of course, compensate Miss Elspeth for her birds. He named a price. It was insultingly low, barely more than what Jedediah Smith had asked for them a year ago. A stunned silence fell over the room. They had come to her for help, and now the wealthiest man in the county was trying to rob her in public. "That ain't right," a voice called from the crowd. It was Mr. Gunderson. "Those birds saved my family. She asked for nothing. She is one person alone." Blackwood boomed, his composure cracking. "She cannot manage an effort of this scale. What does a lone woman know of logistics, of pestilence control on a county-wide basis?" He sneered. "She has what, 100 birds? It's a drop in the ocean. 153, actually," Elspeth said. Her voice was not loud, but it cut through the room like a clean knife. Everyone turned to look at her. She stood straight, her chin up, meeting Blackwood's furious gaze without flinching. "And they aren't for sale." A gasp went through the room. No one spoke to Silas Blackwood like that. His face, already ruddy, darkened to a deep, dangerous purple. "You refuse to help this town in its hour of need?" he roared, trying to turn the crowd against her. "I refuse to be cheated," Elspeth said, her voice still level and calm. "And I refuse to let one man decide who gets help and who doesn't." She took a step forward, and the crowd parted for her, as if she were Moses at the Red Sea. Finn stayed right with her, a small, fierce shadow. "My birds are not a folk remedy, Mr. Blackwood. They are the answer, and they will be shared with everyone who needs them, fairly." She then laid out her own plan. It was simple, practical, and generous. She would divide her flock into 10 smaller flocks. Each flock would be loaned to a group of neighboring families for 1 week. They would be responsible for moving the portable pens from pasture to pasture, from yard to yard. At the end of the week, they would pass the flock to the next group of families. Finn would keep the schedule, and she would oversee the health of the birds. The only price was that each family had to provide a share of grain for the birds' upkeep and contribute 1 day of labor to building more mobile shelters. It was a plan built on community, not on profit. It was a plan that empowered everyone. The room erupted in murmurs of approval. It was brilliant. It was fair. It was the opposite of everything Blackwood represented. He saw his authority vanishing before his eyes. Desperate, he played his final, foolish card. "It will never work," he shouted. "You can't keep track of it all. How would you even know if birds were lost or stolen? How would you know if your count was off?" He sneered, his lip curling. "For all we know, you might be lying about your numbers now. How many did you say you have? 152? 153? It was a fatal mistake." The room went dead silent. Elspeth's gaze sharpened. Finn, who had counted the birds every single night for months, stepped forward. "It's 153, the boy said, his voice piping but clear. "But yesterday, it was 154. One of the young ones went missing from the coop last night." Elspeth looked directly at Blackwood, and a slow, cold understanding dawned in her eyes. "Yes," she said, her voice soft but carrying to every corner of the room. "One went missing. How did you know the count might be off, Mr. Blackwood?" The implication hung in the air, heavy and damning. How could he know a bird was missing unless he was the one who took it? To test her? To see if she was as meticulous as people claimed? His face went pale. He had been caught by his own arrogance. He opened his mouth, but no words came out. He was exposed, outwitted by the very woman he had sought to crush. Mr. Gunderson stood up, his face hard as granite. "I think Mr. Blackwood has lost enough cattle for one season. Maybe he ought to focus on his own fences." A wave of quiet, affirmative laughter rippled through the hall. It was not the cruel laughter that had once followed Elspeth. It was the laughter of a community finding its strength, of a bully getting his due. Silas Blackwood, for the first time in his life, was speechless. He grabbed his hat and stalked out of the town hall, the weight of 100 accusing stares on his back. The meeting was over. Blackwood had lost. Elspeth had not so much won as she had simply prevailed by being steady, fair, and right. In the weeks that followed, Elspeth's plan went into motion. It worked with the simple, elegant precision of a well-oiled machine. The lending flocks, as they came to be called, rotated through the valley. The sight of the mottled birds and their mobile pens became a symbol of recovery. The sound of their chattering, once an annoyance, became the sound of hope. The fever vanished completely. The remaining cattle grew healthy. The ticks, once a biblical plague, became a rarity. Children could once again play in the grass without fear. Providence Creek came back to life. Elspeth became the quiet, undisputed heart of the town. She never sought power, but authority settled on her shoulders as naturally as a shawl. People came to her not just for the birds, but for advice. Her opinion was sought on planting times, on water conservation, on the simple, practical arithmetic of survival. She spoke little, but when she did, people listened. They had learned, the hard way, that she saw things they didn't. She understood the language of the land. Silas Blackwood was a broken man. His reputation was shattered, his arrogance exposed as hollow. He sold off the remainder of his herd at a massive loss and was rarely seen in town again. The power he had wielded for so long had evaporated in a single evening, undone by his own greed and a young woman's quiet resolve. Finn was no longer the sharecropper's hungry boy. He was Elspeth's acknowledged apprentice, the keeper of the flocks. He had a ledger where he tracked the rotation of the birds, the grain contributions, and the new hatchlings. He walked with a new confidence, his small frame filled with a sense of purpose. He was no longer an outcast, but a vital part of the town's machinery. One evening, as the autumn sun bled across the horizon, painting the sky in shades of orange and rose, Elspeth stood on the rise of her land. Old Man Hemlock was with her, leaning on the fence he had leaned on so many months before. Finn was nearby, carefully latching the door to the stone shelter where the home flock was settling in for the night. Below them, in the Gundersons' pasture, one of the lending flocks moved through the twilight, a living, breathing tide of gray against the greening grass. "You did a good thing," Hemlock said, his voice a quiet rumble. "You could have taken much. You chose to give much. It was the only choice," Elspeth said. It was true. The thought of hoarding her discovery, of profiting from her neighbor's terror, had never seriously crossed her mind. To do so would have been a betrayal of the land itself, of the partnership she had forged with her strange, noisy flock. She had learned their language, and it was not a language of greed. It was a language of tireless work, of community, of cleaning the world one small piece at a time. The town now called her birds Providence fowl. They were a living landmark, a piece of local history. No one remembered Jedediah Smith's shame or the laughter that had followed her down the road. They only remembered the silence of the fever and the glorious, raucous noise that broke it. Hemlock nodded, a slow, satisfied smile creasing his face. He looked from Elspeth to the flock and back again. "The land speaks," he said, repeating the words he had given her like a gift so long ago. "A good animal speaks the language of the land it needs," he paused, his pale eyes twinkling in the fading light. "And a good farmer learns to listen." Elspeth looked out at her 10 acres, no longer a patch of scorned earth, but the heart of a healed community. She listened to the soft, conversational clicks of the birds settling for the night, a sound that was now as comforting as a lullaby. She had listened, and the whole world had changed. The following spring, the rains returned. The creek swelled to its banks, and the land, cleansed and rested, exploded in a riot of green. The pastures had never been so lush, the wildflowers never so vibrant. The memory of the drought and the fever was still there, a shadow that made the present brightness all the more precious. Elspeth's flock had grown. Through careful management and the community's shared effort, the original 153 had become nearly 400. The lending flocks were a permanent institution, rotating through the valley as a preventative measure, a constant, chattering assurance that the plague would not return. Her garden, too, had expanded. With the income from her produce and the fair payments she'd received for her flock services, she'd been able to buy the adjoining 10 acres, a scrubby plot that had belonged to a speculator who'd abandoned it years ago. She and Finn, now taller and with the first hints of a young man's build, worked it together. They weren't clearing it for crops, but seeding it with native grasses and clover, creating a perfect, expanded territory for the home flock. The town of Providence Creek was transformed. The shared crisis and the communal solution had forged a new bond between the families. The old lines of pride and pity had blurred. Mr. Gunderson now stopped by Elspeth's fence not to offer pity, but to share a new variety of seed he'd acquired. Mrs. Pickett, fully recovered, brought her a freshly baked loaf of bread every Saturday, a silent, weekly offering of thanks. Hunger changes a town, but so does salvation. The prosperity was not just Elspeth's. It was shared. With the cattle herds healthy, the ranches thrived. With the fields safe, the harvests were bountiful. Elspeth's quiet act of generosity had created a ripple of abundance that touched everyone. She never became a grand lady. She still lived in her small cabin, her hands still rough from work. Her triumph was not in wealth, but in her security and the deep, earned respect of her community. She was no longer Elspeth alone, the foolish girl with the noisy birds. She was simply Elspeth, a name that now meant wisdom and resilience. One day, a wagon pulled up to her gate. It was a new family, strangers, looking to settle in the valley. The man, a farmer with hopeful eyes, had heard the stories. "We were told to come see you first, ma'am," he said, twisting his hat in his hands. "They said you're the one who knows the land." Elspeth looked at the man, at his tired wife, at the 2 small children peering from the back of the wagon. She saw her own past in their hopeful, anxious faces. She could have been grand. She could have been intimidating. Instead, she smiled, a warm, genuine smile that reached her eyes. "The land is good," she said. "But it has its own rules," she called to Finn, who was checking the water trough. "Finn, why don't you show our new neighbors where the South Pasture flock is working today? I think they'd be interested to see them." As the family walked with Finn toward the sound of the guineas, Elspeth remained by the fence. She watched them go, her heart full. She had not set out to be a leader or a savior. She had only wanted to survive on her own terms, to make a life on a piece of land no one else wanted. She had simply paid attention, worked hard, and when the moment came, she had chosen generosity over greed. The rest had followed as naturally as rain. The birds were her legacy, a living, breathing, squawking testament to the idea that value is often hidden, that the thing the world mocks is sometimes the very thing it needs most. It is easier to believe a thing is worthless than to admit you were wrong to mock it, but Providence Creek had learned its lesson. And Elspeth, standing on her quiet hill, listening to the familiar, chaotic music of her flock, was at peace. She had found her place, not by shouting, but by listening.